The night my father threw me out, it was snowing so hard the streetlights looked like they were drowning. I remember the way his voice cracked, not with sadness, but with rage. I remember my suitcase hitting the porch like it weighed nothing. I remember my mother standing behind him, silent, her hands trembling against her chest. And I remember the secret I never told a single soul. 15 years later, when I heard the knock on my apartment door at 6:12 a.m., I thought it was a delivery. It wasn't. It was them. And what they wanted, it changed everything. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal, and if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one who had been cut off by family over something that wasn't even the full truth. The messages poured in. My parents chose pride over me. They believed someone else's lie. I was punished for something I never explained. And that's when I knew it was finally time to tell mine. I was 17 and stupidly in love with the idea that my father would always protect me. He was the kind of man people respected, a self-made contractor, firm handshake, early mornings, zero tolerance for weakness. In our small town of Ohio, his word was law, at least inside our house. And I had broken it, or at least that's what he believed. It started with a locked drawer. My father kept important documents in his office downstairs, business contracts, old tax files, receipts. The drawer was always locked, always, until one afternoon it wasn't. I wasn't snooping, I swear I wasn't. I had gone downstairs to grab a pen, that's it. But the drawer was slightly open, and something inside caught my eye. An envelope with my name written across it in my mother's handwriting. Not sweetheart, not honey, my full name. I pulled it out. Inside was a hospital bill dated 17 years ago, my birth year, but my father's name wasn't listed. Another man's was. The world didn't tilt. It didn't spin. It stopped. I didn't confront anyone right away. I didn't even know what I was looking at. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was insurance. Maybe it meant nothing. But once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. For 3 days, I carried that envelope in my backpack like it was radioactive. And then my father found it. He didn't yell at first. He just stood in my bedroom doorway holding the opened envelope, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. "Where did you get this?" I tried to speak. My throat felt like sandpaper. "It was in your drawer," I said. "It was unlocked." That's when everything exploded. He accused me of snooping, of digging into things that weren't mine, of disrespect, of betrayal. Betrayal. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't ruined my life. "I should have known," he said. "You've never been like me." That sentence cut deeper than anything else. Not like me. I didn't even know what it meant yet, but something in his eyes told me he did. My mother tried to intervene, but he shut her down with a single look. I asked him the only question that mattered. Is he my father? Silence. Not denial, not reassurance, silence. And that was all the answer I needed. He packed my bag that night, said I could stay with whoever my real family was. I didn't even know who that was. He shoved $200 into my coat pocket like it was charity, like I was already a stranger. My mother whispered I'm sorry as I stepped onto the porch, but she didn't follow me. That hurt more than the cold. The door closed, and just like that, I didn't have a home anymore. I slept at a friend's house for 2 weeks before their parents started asking questions. I dropped out of high school, got my GED, worked double shifts at a diner off Route 23. I told people my parents had moved. It was easier than explaining abandonment. But the worst part wasn't the financial struggle. It was the doubt. Was I the product of an affair? Was my entire childhood built on a lie? Did my father look at me all those years knowing I wasn't biologically his? And if he did he ever actually love me? I wrote letters. I never sent them. I waited for a call. It never came. Birthdays passed, Christmas passed, graduation passed. Nothing. After a year, I stopped checking the mailbox. After 5, I stopped hoping. After 10, I stopped caring. Or at least, I thought I had. I built a life from scratch, moved to Chicago, worked my way up from hostess to restaurant manager, rented a tiny studio apartment with peeling paint and a view of a brick wall. It was mine. Every time I paid rent on time, it felt like revenge. Every time I signed my name on a lease, it felt like proof that I didn't need him. But there was one thing I never did. I never looked for the other man, the name on that hospital bill, because some truths, once uncovered, burn everything. 15 years passed like that, quiet, controlled, stable, until the knock. 6:12 a.m., 3 sharp raps against the wood. I remember staring at the clock, thinking, who in the world shows up before sunrise? I opened the door without checking, and there they were, my father. My mother, older, smaller, different, but undeniably them. My father looked thinner. My mother's hair was almost completely gray. For a split second, nobody spoke. Then my father said something I never expected to hear. "We need your help." Help? From the daughter he erased, from the secret he never let me explain. My heart didn't race. It went still, because the look in his eyes wasn't pride anymore. It wasn't anger either. It was desperation. And desperation means one thing. Something had gone terribly wrong. But what he said next made me question everything I thought I knew about that envelope. 15 years of silence, of birthdays spent pretending I didn't care, of holidays where I forced myself not to dial a number I still knew by heart. And now they were standing at my door like the last decade and a half had been a long weekend. My father didn't step inside. He just stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, as if the cold had followed him in from Ohio. "We need your help," he repeated. My mother's eyes met mine. They were red, not from the wind, from crying. I crossed my arms more to hold myself together than to look strong. "With what?" They exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations married couples perfect over time. And suddenly I was 17 again, standing in my bedroom doorway while they decided my fate without including me. My father cleared his throat. "It's about the house." The house. The same house I'd been thrown out of like unwanted mail. "What about it?" I asked. "We're losing it." The words landed softly, too softly for what they meant. My father had built that house with his own hands. I remembered watching him frame the back porch one summer, sweat dripping from his chin, pride glowing in his eyes. That house was his legacy, his proof of success. "Your business?" I asked. He hesitated, just a second too long. "It hasn't been doing well." That was the first crack in the image I'd carried of him for years, the invincible man, the one who never lost. My mother stepped forward then, voice trembling. "We wouldn't have come if there was another option." I almost laughed at that. Another option? There had been another option 15 years ago, too. It was called talking to me, listening, asking questions before packing my life into a suitcase. But I didn't say it. Instead, I asked the question that had lived under my skin for over a decade. Why now? Silence again. Not awkward, calculated. And then my father said something that made my stomach drop. "It's not just the house." He finally stepped inside. They sat at my small kitchen table like guests in a museum exhibit of my life, my framed GED certificate, the chipped mug collection, the stack of unopened mail I'd been meaning to deal with. They looked around quietly, as if measuring what I had built without them. "It's your mother," he said. My chest tightened. She looked away. "She needs surgery," he continued. "It's serious." I stared at her. She forced a weak smile. "What kind of surgery?" She didn't answer. My father did. "Kidney." The word hit me harder than I expected. "She's been on dialysis for 8 months," he added. "We didn't tell you because—" Because what? Because I wasn't family? Because secrets were easier than apologies? "She needs a donor," my mother whispered. And suddenly the room felt smaller. My brain moved faster than my heart could keep up. "You think I'm a match?" My father swallowed. "We don't know." But they hoped. Of course they hoped. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. This was insane. They had cut me off like a bad investment, and now they were here asking for an organ. An organ! Part of my body. Part of me. The irony was almost poetic. "Why me?" I asked quietly. My father's jaw tightened again, but not in anger, in shame. "You're her daughter." The words scraped against my ribs. Daughter. He hadn't called me that in 15 years. I looked at my mother. She reached for my hand, hesitant. "Please." That single word carried more weight than every silent Christmas combined. But there was something else beneath it. Fear. Not just of dying, of losing something else. And then I realized something that made my pulse spike. If I wasn't biologically his, then whose kidney did I carry? "You never answered me," I said slowly, "about the envelope." The temperature in the room shifted. My father's face hardened, not with rage this time, but with dread. "Not now," he muttered. "Yes, now. Because I wasn't 17 anymore. I wasn't scared of being thrown out. There was nothing left to take from me." "Who is he?" I asked. "The name on the hospital bill." My mother's grip tightened on my hand. My father stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city like it might offer an escape route. "It was a mistake," he said. A mistake. I almost smiled at the understatement. "What was a mistake?" I pressed. My mother's voice broke first. "I never cheated." The sentence hung in the air. My father turned sharply. "Tell her," she said to him. "She deserves to know." Deserves. 15 years too late. He exhaled slowly. "That name on the bill was the doctor." I blinked. "What?" "The hospital listed the attending physician as the responsible party for insurance. It was a clerical thing. I thought you knew that." My brain scrambled to catch up. "That wasn't my biological father?" "No," my mother said immediately, tears forming. "Your father has always been your father." The room spun, not from shock this time, but from anger. "I threw you out," I whispered. My father looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. "I thought you were digging," he said. "I thought you didn't trust us. I thought—" "You thought I was accusing you." He didn't deny it. He chose pride over clarification, chose ego over conversation, chose anger over love, and it cost us 15 years. I laughed once. It sounded hollow. "So you destroyed our family over paperwork?" His silence confirmed it. My mother started crying fully then. "I begged him not to," she said. "I told him to explain it, but he said if you didn't trust us enough to ask first—" He made my curiosity into betrayal, my confusion into disloyalty. I stood up, pacing the tiny kitchen. "I could have called," I said. "Once, just once." My father's voice cracked for the first time. "I thought you hated me." The simplicity of that broke something in me. "I was 17, I said. "I was scared." "I was too," he admitted. And that was the first honest thing he said since walking in. The truth settled slowly. I wasn't the product of an affair. I wasn't someone else's child. I hadn't uncovered a scandal. I had uncovered a misunderstanding, a catastrophic, ego-fueled, pride-driven misunderstanding, and it had stolen half my life. I sat back down, exhausted. "So now you need my kidney," I said quietly. My mother wiped her face. "We need a test first." "And if I'm not a match?" My father answered. "Then we'll figure something else out." But his voice said what his pride wouldn't. They were out of options. I looked at them, at the lines in their faces, at the way time had softened them. They weren't the towering figures of my childhood anymore. They were aging, fragile, human. And for the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected. Regret. Real, consuming regret. But forgiveness doesn't come automatically just because someone is sick, and love doesn't erase damage just because it resurfaces. "I'll take the test," I said finally. My mother sobbed in relief. My father nodded once, like it was a business agreement. But as they stood to leave, he paused at the door. "There's something else," he said. Of course there was. "There's debt," he continued. "Medical bills, the house loan. If—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "If she didn't survive, if the surgery failed, if everything collapsed." He looked at me, not as a contractor, not as a man defending his pride, but as a father who had run out of control. "If you are a match," he said slowly, "it won't just save her, it will save us." That's what he meant. And suddenly I realized this wasn't just about a kidney. It was about redemption, about whether I would give them something they had refused to give me 15 years ago. Grace. But what none of us knew yet was that the test results were about to reveal something none of us were prepared for, something that would make that hospital envelope look like a harmless misunderstanding. Because when the doctor called 3 weeks later, he didn't start with, "You're a match." He started with, "There's an inconsistency in your DNA."
There's an inconsistency in your DNA. The doctor's voice was calm, clinical, detached. Mine wasn't. "What kind of inconsistency?" I asked, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers went numb. There was a pause, the kind doctors use when they're choosing words carefully. "The compatibility markers between you and your mother are unusual." Unusual. Not impossible, not incompatible. Unusual. My chest tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means," he continued gently, "that according to this test, you are not a biological match to the woman listed as your mother." The world didn't shatter this time. It hollowed. I stared at the wall across from me, watching a crack in the paint like it might rearrange into a different reality. "That's not possible," I whispered. "It's rare," he said, "but not impossible. There are medical explanations, lab errors, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Or you're not her child." My mind went back to that envelope, back to my father's rage, my mother's silence, back to 15 years ago. Had we misunderstood the wrong thing? I drove to the hospital the next morning. They were both already there, sitting side by side in the waiting room like two people bracing for impact. My mother smiled when she saw me. "Did they call you?" she asked hopefully. I didn't sit. "Yes." The word came out flat. My father read my face immediately. "What is it?" I swallowed. "They said I'm not a match." My mother's shoulders dropped, but she nodded as if she'd prepared herself for that possibility. "That's okay," she whispered. "We'll look elsewhere." I didn't look at her. "There's more." The air shifted. I forced the words out. "They said I'm not biologically related to you." Silence, but not confusion, not shock. My mother's hand slowly gripped the armrest of her chair. My father's face drained of color. And in that moment, I knew. They weren't surprised. "Tell me," I said quietly. My voice didn't shake. It burned. My father stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Tests get mixed up all the time." But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at her. My mother's eyes filled with tears instantly. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. "When? Before or after the transplant?" "Don't!" my father snapped. "Don't what?" I turned to him. "Don't ask questions? That worked out great last time."
A nurse glanced over from across the hall. We lowered our voices, but not the tension. My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. "Please," she said, "sit down." I didn't. "I gave birth to you," she said through tears. "You are my daughter." "That's not what the test says." "There are things you don't understand." "Then help me understand." She looked at my father, and this time he didn't stop her. "It was fertility treatment," she said softly. I blinked. "What?" "We tried for years before you. I had miscarriages, 3 of them. I hadn't known that. They told us we might never conceive naturally, so we agreed to assisted reproduction." The word echoed. Assisted. "With a donor," she finished. The floor felt unstable. "A sperm donor?" I asked automatically. She shook her head. "No." My breath stalled. "An egg donor." Everything inside me froze. My father wasn't just my biological father in this room. He was my only biological parent, and the woman who carried me, raised me, held me through fevers and nightmares didn't share my DNA? "I don't understand," I said, my voice suddenly small. "My eggs weren't viable," she explained. "They used a donor egg and your father's sperm. I carried you. I gave birth to you. But genetically—" She couldn't finish. My mind flashed back to the envelope. The hospital bill. The wrong name. It hadn't been about an affair. It had been about fertility treatment. And they never told me? "Why?" I asked. It came out sharper than I intended. "Why didn't you tell me?" My father answered this time. "Because you were ours." That's not an answer. He rubbed his forehead like he was reliving a migraine 15 years in the making. "In our generation, you didn't talk about that. It was private. It was shameful." "Shameful?" I repeated. My mother cried harder. "I was scared. I was terrified that if you knew, you'd feel like I wasn't really your mother." I stared at her. "Instead," I said quietly, "you let me think I was the result of an affair." She flinched. "We didn't know you saw the bill," she whispered. "But when I asked, you stayed silent." My father's voice broke again. "I thought you had figured it out." "Figured what out?" "That you weren't biologically hers." The words felt like acid. "And instead of explaining it," I said slowly, "you kicked me out." His silence was answer enough. I sank into the chair across from them. 15 years. 15 years of abandonment because I accidentally discovered a medical procedure? "You chose pride," I said, staring at my father. "Again." He didn't argue. My mother reached for me once more. "You are my daughter," she said firmly. "DNA doesn't change that." I wanted to believe her, but something inside me had shifted. If she wasn't genetically connected to me, then somewhere out there was a woman who was, a stranger who shared my eyes, my smile, my blood. And suddenly, the kidney test wasn't just about compatibility, it was about identity. "Does anyone else know?" I asked. They shook their heads. "Not even family?" "No." "So if I hadn't taken this test, you might never have known," my father admitted. The honesty hurt more than the lie. The nurse called my mother's name for dialysis prep. She stood slowly. Before walking away, she looked at me like she had when I was a child afraid of thunderstorms. "Please don't disappear again," she said. The irony almost made me laugh. I hadn't disappeared. I had been erased. My father stayed behind while she was taken down the hall. "She didn't want this to come out like this," he said quietly. "How did you want it to come out? At your wedding, when we're old and dying?" He didn't respond. Do you know who the donor is? His jaw tightened. No. You never looked? We signed anonymous agreements. But records exist. Yes. The word hung heavy. You're thinking about finding her. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. Because I was. I left the hospital an hour later with more questions than I'd ever had in my life. I wasn't the product of betrayal, but I was the product of secrecy, and secrecy had destroyed us once already. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. It was the transplant coordinator. We ran additional panels, she said carefully. There's something else you should know. I closed my eyes. Go ahead. There's a secondary match in our system, very high compatibility markers. My heart pounded. What does that mean? It means, she said slowly, that whoever your biological mother is, she's already in our donor registry. The world tilted again. She was alive, she was local, and she might be the only person who could save the woman who raised me, the woman who wasn't my biological mother, the woman who chose silence instead of truth. I stood in the parking lot, snow beginning to fall, just like it had 15 years ago. History was repeating, but this time, I wasn't the confused teenager. I was the one holding the truth, and I had to decide, would I open a door that could change every identity I thought I had, or would I protect the fragile family that finally admitted the truth? Because the next call I made would determine whether I met the stranger who gave me life and whether she would be willing to give it again.
The snow fell harder as I drove back to my apartment, headlights cutting swaths through the gray morning. My mind raced faster than the tires on the icy road. One call, one decision, and everything could change. I pulled into the lot and sat in the car, phone trembling in my hand. I knew the registry had a strict confidentiality policy. The donor's identity wouldn't be revealed without permission, but the transplant coordinator had implied that the contact could happen if I chose to reach out. Could I? Should I? The stranger who shared my DNA was somewhere in this world. She might be living a life completely unaware of me. She might be normal. She might be different. Or worse, she might not want to meet me. I thought about my mother, the woman who raised me, who loved me despite not sharing my blood. She had waited 15 years to tell me the truth, and she needed me now more than ever. The weight of that paradox pressed down on me. Could I ask a stranger to save someone else's life? And if I did, would I even recognize the generosity behind the gift? I spent the next hour pacing, weighing the impossible options. I thought about the letters I had written but never sent, about birthdays and holidays I spent alone, about the anger that had taken root like weeds in my chest. And then I realized something. 15 years ago, I had been powerless. I had been 17, naive, and completely dependent on their choices. But now I was the one who held the power. The decision wasn't just about the kidney. It was about agency, about who controlled the story, about whether I would let the past dictate the present or finally take charge. I picked up the phone and dialed the transplant coordinator. My hand shook, but my voice didn't waver. I want to contact the secondary match, I said. The coordinator paused, then replied, "We'll initiate the process, but it won't be immediate. She has to consent to communication." Consent, another word layered with uncertainty. I hung up, heart hammering. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, blood tests, and endless waiting. Every time my phone rang, my stomach lurched. Every email notification made me jump. Then, 3 days later, a message appeared. It was from the registry. "The donor has agreed to contact. Please schedule a meeting." Meeting? Not phone call, not anonymous exchange. A real meeting, face to face.
I stared at the text. My hands went cold. I wanted to call my mother to tell her everything was happening, but the hospital had strict privacy rules. This had to remain confidential until the donor and I met. I was about to meet the woman who gave me life, or at least half of it. I chose a small cafe for the meeting, neutral territory, public enough to feel safe, private enough for conversation. I arrived early, nerves coiling in my stomach. I rehearsed questions in my head. Who is she? How does she live? Does she know about my mother? Does she know she created a life she'd never raise? Time passed slowly, 15 minutes, 20, 30, and then she arrived. She walked in with the quiet confidence of someone who had no idea her actions would one day ripple across lives. Her hair was dark, streaked with early gray. Her eyes, I stopped short. They were mine. Not like my mother's, mine. She smiled softly when she saw me, hesitation in her movements. I mirrored her, unsure of whether to reach out. "Are you—" I started. "Yes," she said, nodding. "I think I know why we're here." Her voice was warm, calm, and familiar, and in that instant, all 15 years of questions and rage and abandonment condensed into one overwhelming truth. She had a choice too, and she had chosen me. We sat across from each other, hands barely touching over the table. The cafe buzzed with life around us, oblivious to the universe-altering conversation unfolding in its corner. "Do you know about her?" I asked, voice barely a whisper. "Yes," she said. "Your mother told me everything. She didn't want you to know, not yet." "Why?" "Because she didn't want to hurt you, and because she loved you." I wanted to scream at the injustice. 15 years of silence, of misunderstanding, of being treated like an intruder in my own life. But the anger wouldn't come, not yet. Instead, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. She existed. She was real. She was alive. And she had agreed on her own to be part of this journey. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "You don't have to say anything yet," she replied. "We'll take this one step at a time." I nodded, my throat tight. She didn't know me, really, but somehow in that moment, it felt like we had always been connected. The following week was a whirlwind of meetings and medical tests. The hospital was now the center of gravity for a story that spanned 15 years, dozens of emotions, and endless secrets. My mother's condition was deteriorating, the dialysis taking a heavier toll each day. I visited her in between tests, holding her hand, trying not to think about the pain in her eyes. "You've always been my daughter," she whispered. "Blood doesn't change that." I squeezed her hand, feeling the paradox more sharply than ever. She was not my biological mother, but she had given me everything. Everything I knew, everything I loved. And yet, the donor, the stranger, she held a piece of me that no one else could get. I couldn't ignore it. And then came the day the donor was cleared for surgery. A perfect match, no complications anticipated. I watched her leave for the procedure, feeling an odd mix of gratitude, awe, and fear. When the surgery was complete, the doctor stepped out. "She's stable. Recovery is expected to be smooth." Relief washed over me. My mother was alive, but the world had shifted irreversibly. I couldn't unsee the truth. I couldn't undo the years lost to silence. I couldn't ignore the fact that a stranger had become a hero in my family's life. In the weeks that followed, my mother recovered, slowly regaining her strength. My father stayed quiet, his pride softened, replaced with a tentative humility. And I began to reconcile the past with the present. I met with the donor again, more casually this time. Coffee, laughter, shared stories. She told me about her life, her work, the choices she had made. And I told her about mine, the life I had built from the ruins of misunderstanding. There was no perfect resolution, no magical healing of 15 years of pain, but there was connection, and in that connection there was hope. One evening, as I sat in my apartment reflecting on everything, I realized how fragile and fleeting life really was. 15 years ago, a misunderstanding had severed a family. Now, a stranger had become a lifeline. I thought about the envelope, the knock at my door, the DNA test, about all the moments that could have gone differently. And I understood something crucial. The truth, however painful, always surfaces, and when it does, we have to choose what we do with it. Forgiveness isn't simple. Healing isn't immediate, but survival is a catalyst for everything else. And sometimes the people who hurt us most, the secrets that scar us, the strangers who change our lives, they all collide in a way that teaches us who we really are. I had been a lost, abandoned 17-year-old. Now I was a woman who had navigated betrayal, secrets, and life-altering truths, and survived. The past wasn't erased, but I had reclaimed the present. And for the first time in 15 years, I felt whole.
The weeks that followed were surreal. My mother's recovery was slow but steady. Her hands, once frail from months of dialysis, grew stronger. Her smile returned, fragile at first, then steadier, like dawn breaking after a long, bitter night. My father, meanwhile, stayed quiet. He hovered on the edges of the apartment, awkward, unsure how to re-enter a life he had once abandoned. Pride had been his armor for so long that vulnerability felt foreign, uncomfortable, almost unbearable. And I was learning to navigate the complexity of being a daughter again. 15 years of absence, resentment, and distance couldn't vanish overnight. Every touch, every word, every shared moment with my parents was laden with history. Every smile from my mother carried the weight of secrets and silence. Then there was the donor. We kept in touch regularly. Our conversations began cautiously, medical updates, recovery milestones, but slowly we opened up. She shared her story, a life carefully structured, a career she loved, a quiet generosity she rarely acknowledged. She had chosen anonymity, yet here she was, a stranger who became the bridge between life and death. I found myself thinking about her constantly, wondering what it meant to share DNA with someone I had never known. We had the same eyes, the same curve of the lips when laughing, the same streak of stubbornness that had gotten me through years of anger and silence. And yet, she was a stranger. There was tension in that reality, a dichotomy I had never faced before. The woman who carried me, nurtured me, loved me unconditionally was not my genetic mother, and the woman who gave me the biology to live had no other connection to me. I realized that blood alone does not define family. Love does, nurture does, history does, and yet identity is shaped by both. One evening I sat in my apartment, scrolling through the registry's portal. I was tempted, anxious to find out more about her, the donor who had saved my mother's life. But there were boundaries, rules, ethics. I could only know what she agreed to share, and she had chosen cautiously. It was during that moment of reflection that my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered hesitantly. "Hello?" A calm, feminine voice replied. "Miriam?" My breath caught. "Yes, I'm the donor. I wanted to speak with you before your mother comes home from the hospital tomorrow." I sat back, heart hammering. The very idea of speaking with the woman who had shared her DNA, who had physically made my mother's survival possible, made reality feel elastic. "Of course," I said. We spoke for nearly an hour, quietly, cautiously. She shared small details about her life, her family, her hopes. I shared small fragments of mine, the journey from the apartment I had grown up in to the city where I had built my independence. We laughed nervously at the coincidences, our shared stubbornness, our shared patterns of thought, our shared fear of confrontation. It was intimate, yet distant, familiar, yet foreign. And then she said something that stopped me. "You remind me of someone I lost," she whispered. I froze. "Who?" "My younger sister," she said softly. "I never had children of my own, but when I saw your DNA, I felt like I had a second chance." The words hit harder than I expected. I felt the weight of a life that had intersected with mine in ways I had never imagined. "You saved my mother's life," I said. "You changed everything." "No," she replied. "We did this together. You did what you had to do. You reached out. You made the decision." Her words grounded me. Responsibility, choice, life, all intertwined. I realized I was no longer the lost teenager thrown out of a house I thought was mine. I was a woman capable of decision, capable of shaping outcomes, capable of reconciling with both love and betrayal. The next day, my mother came home. Her steps were cautious, tentative, but her smile was triumphant. She was alive, she was whole, and for the first time in years, I felt like a child again, not abandoned, not betrayed, but cherished. The donor and I had agreed to remain in touch, carefully, respectfully. There would be no rush, no forced closeness. We had survived trauma, secrets, betrayal, and yet here we were, two women connected by life and blood, learning to navigate the nuances of a bond neither of us had sought, but one that existed nonetheless. I spent the evening sitting with my mother, listening to her stories, tracing the lines of her hands with mine, marveling at the fragility and strength intertwined. "Do you forgive him?" I asked, finally, looking at my father, who sat quietly on the sofa. My mother's eyes softened. "Forgiveness is a choice, and sometimes it comes slowly." I looked at him. He seemed smaller than before, less imposing, more human. The man who had thrown me out, who had chosen anger over explanation, who had destroyed a decade and a half of life, was still here, and he was waiting for a chance. I realized that forgiveness didn't mean erasing the past. It meant acknowledging it, understanding it, and choosing how to move forward. I wanted to forgive, but I also wanted time. 15 years of history isn't reconciled in a day. Over the next months, life settled into a fragile equilibrium. My mother recovered fully, stronger than anyone expected. My father learned to communicate without ego, without anger, without fear. The donor remained a quiet, guiding presence in our lives, not replacing anyone, not interfering, but connecting us to the truth we had long avoided. I began documenting the story, not for the world, but for myself. The envelope, the knock, the betrayal, the secrets, the survival. It was my story, my history, my truth. I wrote every detail, every memory, every raw emotion. I didn't sugarcoat, I didn't minimize. I simply recorded what I'd been. In writing, I found release. In telling the story, I reclaimed the narrative that had been stolen 15 years ago. And then one evening, as I looked out over the city skyline from my apartment, I realized something profound. Life is unpredictable, fragile, and sometimes cruel. People hurt us. Secrets can fester for years. Mistakes can leave scars that never fully heal. But love persists. It is not always easy. It is not always fair. But it is the force that binds strangers, that resurrects broken families, that allows forgiveness and redemption to take root. I had survived betrayal. I had survived secrecy. I had survived 15 years of confusion, anger, and pain. And now I was learning to thrive. Because survival is only the beginning. And the choices we make in the aftermath, the ones we make when the truth is finally revealed, define who we are.
The months after my mother's recovery were some of the most complicated of my life. The initial relief of survival gave way to a deeper reckoning. How do you rebuild relationships fractured by 15 years of secrecy, anger, and misunderstanding? How do you navigate the intricate web of biology and nurture, of choice and consequence? I spent long hours with my mother, not just helping her recover physically, but emotionally bridging the gap we had lived with unknowingly. She would tell me stories I had never heard, of her childhood, of the grief she carried silently after miscarriages, of the fear she felt about telling me the truth. Listening to her, I began to understand how her silence was not betrayal, but protection, albeit misguided. My father, too, was a study in transformation. The once imposing man, whose word had been law, had softened. His anger had subsided into quiet reflection. The pride that had caused years of pain had been replaced by humility. He apologized many times, sometimes with words, sometimes just with presence, as if showing up itself was the act of penance. And then there was the donor. We had begun to establish a tentative, cautious friendship. We met for coffee, shared meals, sometimes just sat in silence, marveling at the oddity of our connection. She had no claim to my upbringing, but she was undeniably part of my existence. I struggled with the paradox. She was both stranger and essential, a living reminder of the fragility and resilience of life.
One rainy afternoon, she invited me to her home. The walls were lined with books and photographs, a life meticulously curated. She poured coffee, her hands steady, her expression calm. "I've thought a lot about you," she said, "about who you are, what you've been through." I nodded, unsure what to say. 15 years of life experiences had been compressed into this single, unexpected meeting. "You've survived more than most people ever have," she continued. "Not just the rejection, the secrecy, the betrayal, but the choices you've had to make afterward. That makes you remarkable." Her words struck me. I had thought survival was about enduring, but she was saying it was about more than that. It was about growth, about learning to navigate the chaos life throws at you, about reclaiming agency in a world that had tried to strip it away. As weeks turned into months, my mother regained her strength, my father his quiet confidence, and I my sense of self. But the shadow of the past never fully disappeared. 15 years of pain, 15 years of misunderstanding, could not simply vanish. Then came the letter. It arrived one morning in my mailbox, handwritten, the kind of cursive that seemed almost archaic in the digital age. I recognized the sender immediately, the donor. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a simple message. "I've been thinking about the life we share, about the past, about the choices that brought us here. I want you to know that you are more than the sum of secrets and misunderstandings. You are the proof that love persists. I hope one day we can meet again, not as strangers connected by biology, but as women who share a bond that transcends time, distance, and circumstance." I read the words over and over. Relief, gratitude, and a strange sense of completeness washed over me. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a step toward reconciliation, toward understanding the intricate web of lives and choices that had brought us here. The following weeks were marked by subtle shifts. My mother began attending local community events, slowly reclaiming the independence she had lost to illness. My father, once rigid and controlling, found joy in small acts of humility, helping neighbors, volunteering, simply listening without judgment. And I, caught between the past and the present, began to integrate all the disparate pieces of my identity. I was a daughter, a survivor, a woman shaped by love, betrayal, secrecy, and revelation. I was connected to two mothers in different ways, a father in both love and biology, and a stranger who had given me life in ways I had never anticipated. One evening, as I walked through the city streets, snow lightly falling around me, I thought about the envelope that had started it all, about the knock at my door 15 years ago, about the DNA test that had changed everything. I realized that every moment of pain, every act of secrecy, every misunderstanding had led me here. Here, where I understood that life is fragile, that love is complicated, and that forgiveness is not a single act, but a process. Then the call came. It was from the hospital. "Your mother's follow-up results are back," the doctor said. "There's something you need to know. It's urgent." My heart sank. After months of stability, after careful recovery, the word urgent felt like a storm warning. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The surgery was successful, but there are complications," he said. "Her body is reacting to the transplant differently than expected. We need to adjust her treatment immediately." I felt a familiar panic rising, the same as 15 years ago when I had first faced the chaos of my family's secrets. But this time I wasn't powerless. I had learned to navigate uncertainty, to make decisions under pressure, to act with both courage and clarity. "I'll be there," I said, my voice firm. The hours that followed were tense. My mother lay in the hospital bed, pale but alert. Doctors and nurses moved efficiently, monitoring vitals, adjusting medications, explaining each step to me with clinical precision. I held her hand, feeling the warmth of life that had been preserved through a series of extraordinary circumstances. I thought about the donor, the woman who had given her a second chance, and the irony that my life was now intertwined with hers in ways I could never have imagined. In the quiet moments, when machines hummed and monitors beeped, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. Betrayal, secrecy, and silence had marked my adolescence and early adulthood, but survival, choice, and love had defined my present. I realized that the real miracle wasn't the transplant. It was the way life had woven together disparate threads: love, biology, nurture, courage, forgiveness, into a tapestry more complex, more beautiful, and more resilient than I could have imagined. By the time my mother's condition stabilized, a new understanding had settled over our family. The envelope, the knock, the 15 years of separation, all had become part of a story we could face together. We were not perfect, we were fractured, we were human, but we were alive. And in life, sometimes that is enough.
The night the complication worsened, the hospital corridors felt like a labyrinth designed to test the limits of endurance. My mother's vitals had dropped unexpectedly, and alarms blared intermittently, each one piercing the quiet like a sharp reminder that life can pivot on a single moment. I sat by her bedside, gripping her hand tightly, willing the warmth to flow from me to her. She smiled faintly, the exhaustion evident in the curve of her lips. "I'm still here," she whispered. "Yes," I replied, voice strained, "and I won't let anything take you." The donor had been called in as a precaution in case there were further complications related to compatibility. She arrived quietly, her presence calm, steady like an anchor in a storm. We had met before, cautiously, sharing conversation, stories, laughter, but now her role had shifted. She was no longer just the woman who shared my DNA. She was a lifeline for the woman who had raised me, a stranger who had become central to the survival of my family. "Is she stable?" I asked, eyes scanning the monitors. "Temporarily," the nurse replied. "We need to move fast if she is going to recover fully." The doctor appeared moments later, his expression taut, professional, but undeniably tense. "Her body is rejecting the transplant," he said. "It's aggressive. We need to intervene immediately. The donor is here, but we may need to take additional measures." I felt my heart stop. 15 years of waiting, surviving, reconciling, all threatening to unravel in this moment. I looked at my father, whose hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white. His pride had been stripped bare by life, and now fear took its place. "Do what you have to do," my father whispered, voice broken. "I trust you." I nodded, though my body felt like stone. There was nothing to do but wait, hope, and act decisively when needed. Hours passed in a blur. Medications were administered, monitors beeped incessantly, and every sound in the room was magnified to an almost unbearable degree. I watched my mother's chest rise and fall, shallow but steady, and thought about the life she had given me, the sacrifices, the silence, the love that had persisted despite absence of biological connection. Then the call came from the lab. "The secondary match," the technician said. "We have results. Immediate action is required. She is an exact match for a rescue donation if you are willing to authorize it." I froze. The words echoed in the sterile hospital room like a bell tolling. Rescue donation, exact match, immediate action. I looked at the donor, who met my gaze without hesitation. Her eyes reflected the gravity of the moment, the unspoken understanding that she was stepping into a role far beyond any plan either of us had anticipated. "I authorize it," I said firmly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Do whatever is necessary." The decision had been made. There was no turning back. The operation was tense, high stakes, the kind of medical procedure where every second mattered. Surgeons moved with precision, nurses anticipated every need, and monitors tracked every heartbeat and oxygen level. I waited in a small observation room, heart in my throat, mind racing through 15 years of pain, betrayal, and now precarious hope. I thought about the knock at my door 15 years ago, the envelope, the secrets, the lies. I thought about the woman who raised me, whose love had never wavered despite the absence of biological truth. I thought about the donor, a stranger turned savior, whose presence now literally meant the difference between life and death. Time blurred. Minutes became hours. The room felt suffocating and infinite at all once. Then finally, the surgeon emerged. "She's stable," he said, though his face betrayed the exhaustion and intensity of the procedure. "The donor was an exact match. We managed the complications, and recovery should proceed normally." Relief washed over me in waves so intense that I nearly collapsed. My mother was alive. My family was whole, not because we had been perfect, but because courage, love, and improbable circumstances had converged in a single miraculous moment. When I finally entered her recovery room, the sight of her lying there, breathing steadily, her eyes blinking open, filled me with a mixture of gratitude, awe, and disbelief. She reached for my hand, and I held it as if letting go would somehow undo the miracle we had all survived. "I thought you lost me," she whispered. "You didn't, and I won't ever let you go again." My father stood silently at the foot of the bed, his expression unreadable. Pride had been stripped from him long ago, but in its place was something rarer, humility, and an earnest understanding of what it means to truly love and protect someone. The donor, standing quietly in the corner, offered only a small nod. No words were necessary. Her actions spoke louder than anything she could have said. Over the next days, recovery continued. My mother's strength grew steadily, her health restored, her energy returning like sunlight breaking through clouds. Each day felt like a second chance, a gift wrought from the convergence of past mistakes, courageous decisions, and human resilience. I found moments to speak with the donor privately. "You saved her," I said softly. "No," she replied, "you did. You made the choices. You reached out. You didn't let the past dictate the present. I just followed your lead." Her words carried a truth I had not fully grasped. Survival and salvation are not solitary acts. They are collaborations, woven together by trust, courage, and the willingness to act in the face of fear. And in that moment, I understood that the bonds of family, biological, chosen, or circumstantial, are defined not just by blood, but by presence, care, and the decisions we make when it matters most. It was during this period of quiet reflection that my father finally spoke to me with full honesty. "I destroyed so much," he said, his voice low and measured. 15 years of silence, all because of fear and pride. I cannot undo it, but I can try to be better starting now." I studied his face. The lines of age and regret were evident, but beneath them was a man transformed, not by surgery, not by DNA tests, not by the donor, but by the weight of what he had lost and the recognition of what truly mattered. "I don't know if I can forgive you fully," I admitted softly, "but I can try to rebuild what was broken. We'll see where that takes us." And in that room, amidst the hum of hospital machines and the soft breaths of recovery, a fragile truce was formed, not perfect, not final, but real. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside my apartment window, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. The envelope, the knock, the 15 years of silence, the secret DNA, the life-saving intervention, it all seemed like a lifetime ago. And yet, it had all led to this singular truth. Love persists, in ways we understand, in ways we do not, and in ways that demand courage, forgiveness, and action. I thought about my mother, fully recovered now, her laugh returning, her energy a beacon of resilience. I thought about my father, learning humility, striving for connection. I thought about the donor, a stranger who had become part of the fabric of our lives. And I realized something essential. The story is not just about betrayal or secrecy or even survival. It's about the choices we make when the stakes are highest, the decisions that define who we are, who we become, and who we allow ourselves to love. For the first time in 15 years, I felt the weight of the past balanced by the possibility of the future. And I understood that the next step, choosing to embrace all parts of my family, biological, chosen, or circumstantial, living and surviving, would define the rest of my life. Because life, in its unpredictable, fragile, extraordinary way, had handed me a second chance, and I was ready. The morning after my mother was discharged, the apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the heater. She sat at the kitchen table, drinking tea, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. My father was in the living room, reading the newspaper silently, a man subdued by both relief and reflection. The donor had left the day before, her presence lingering like an echo of courage, humility, and generosity. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of normalcy, or something like it. But beneath that calm lay layers of history, of choices, of secrets that had shaped the past 15 years. I realized that life doesn't provide clean resolutions. It offers opportunities, second chances, and a chance to redefine the meaning of family. I began to process the journey. 15 years ago, I had been a teenager thrown out of a home I had always thought was mine. I had believed betrayal was absolute. I had nursed anger and resentment like a shield, never realizing that the people I blamed had been trapped in fear, pride, and secrecy just as much as I had been trapped in abandonment. Now, with the veil lifted, I could see them, not as villains, but as flawed humans who had loved imperfectly. My mother had carried me, nurtured me, and protected me. My father had erred, but had also endured his own regrets and shame. The donor, a stranger, had stepped in at a moment of life or death urgency, bridging the gap between survival and loss. Each of them had taught me something profound, that love is not static, that family is not only defined by blood, that courage and choice can reshape lives even after the deepest wounds. One afternoon, I sat with my mother and father in the living room, sunlight spilling across the floor. My mother reached out and took my hand, her grip firm yet gentle. "You've carried so much for so long," she said softly. "I hope you know that none of it was your fault." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I understand now," I said. "It was never just about me. It was about fear and love and decisions made under pressure." My father, usually stoic, looked up from his chair. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I thought protecting my pride would protect you. I see now that it only hurt you." I took a deep breath. Forgiveness didn't come instantly, but it had begun. The first step had always been acknowledgement. And in that quiet moment, 15 years of pain began to untangle, thread by fragile thread. The donor and I continued to communicate. Our bond, once rooted solely in DNA, evolved into something deeper: trust, respect, shared history, and cautious friendship. We laughed, we shared stories, and sometimes we simply sat in silence, recognizing the profound complexity of our connection. Meeting her had taught me that family can be chosen, but it can also be found in unexpected places. It doesn't require upbringing or shared meals or years of living together. Sometimes family is defined by the willingness to act selflessly when it matters most, by the courage to bridge distance, and by the choice to extend care beyond obligation. Months passed. My mother's health stabilized fully, her laughter returning to fill our apartment. My father, once rigid, now moved through life with cautious humility, no longer seeking to dominate every interaction, but instead listening, learning, and engaging honestly. And I, once 17, abandoned, confused, was becoming whole again, integrating all the lessons of survival, betrayal, and revelation. One evening, I walked through the city streets, reflecting on the journey. I thought about the envelope, the knock at the door, the DNA test, the donor's intervention, the months of recovery, the fragile reconciliation. I realized that life is unpredictable, often cruel, and yet astonishingly resilient. We are shaped by the choices of others, yes, but also by our own courage to act, to forgive, and to love. I sat in a small cafe one afternoon, the donor joining me once again. We shared tea and laughter, the awkwardness of strangers intertwined with the familiarity of shared history. She reached across the table, lightly touching my hand. "You've grown so much," she said quietly. "You've taken everything life threw at you and found strength in it." I smiled, understanding fully now. Life had tested me, tested all of us, but it had also shown me the power of resilience, of love, and of choice. "You saved my mother," I said softly. "No," she replied. "You saved her. You made the choice to engage, to act, to embrace the truth. I only followed." Her words resonated deeply. The miracle wasn't simply the transplant. It was the decisions we made in the aftermath of chaos, the courage to reach beyond fear, the willingness to forgive, the choice to love despite the scars. At home that evening, I joined my mother and father on the couch. We shared stories, laughter, and the quiet moments of domesticity that I had once thought impossible. My heart felt full, not perfect, not without past pain, but full of possibility. We discussed our journey openly for the first time, the misunderstandings, the anger, the secrets, and the consequences.
And through conversation, reflection, and mutual recognition, the cracks in our family began to close, not erasing history, but strengthening the bonds that had endured 15 years of distance and pain. I realized, finally, that identity is not only biological. It is emotional, experiential, and moral. It is defined by love, by choice, and by the courage to act in the moments that matter most. That night, I reflected on the story I had lived. 15 years of silence, betrayal, and uncertainty had culminated in survival, reconciliation, and understanding. I had learned that forgiveness is neither immediate nor guaranteed, but it is always possible. I had learned that love persists, even when complicated by secrets, misunderstandings, and time. And I had learned that family is not a simple equation of blood. It is defined by care, choice, and presence. I thought of the donor, a stranger who became central to the survival of those I loved. I thought of my mother, whose courage and love had never faltered. I thought of my father, whose humility had finally made room for connection. And I understood that life, and all its unpredictable and complexity, had given us a chance to heal, to forgive, and to embrace the future. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at the framed photos on the wall. Images of birthdays, holidays, and moments of laughter, mingled with photographs of my mother's recovery, the hospital, and quiet moments with the donor. Each picture was a testament to survival, to choice, and to love. I smiled quietly to myself. The story was not perfect. The past could not be erased. But the future was ours to shape. And in that quiet moment, I realized the most important truth of all. Life is fragile. Love is resilient. And the choices we make, especially the hard ones, determine who we become. I had survived betrayal, secrecy, and the chaos of the past 15 years. And now, for the first time, I was ready to live. Not just survive, but truly, fully, and courageously live. Because the story was mine. The power to shape the next chapter was mine. And I was no longer afraid.